US Air Force Flight Surgeon John Paul Stapp was strapped forward-facing into an exposed chair on the back of a rocket sled that could travel faster than a jumbo jet. Ahead of him was a 2,000-foot-long rail track stretching across the arid landscape of Muroc Army Airfield in California. Stapp himself counted down, his voice sounding over the intercom in the control room some distance away. At 0, the rockets were ignited and the sled accelerated ferociously over the next 5 seconds to an astonishing 632 miles per hour, demolishing the land speed record. Moments later, the sled ploughed into a trough of water which brought it to a brutally abrupt halt. No human before or since has willingly undergone such a jolt, from over 600 miles per hour to rest in a little over a second, the equivalent of hitting a brick wall at 120 miles per hour. So fast had Stapp travelled that dust particles had speared through his flight suit, raising blisters on his body. So suddenly had he slowed down that the capillaries in his eyes burst, his eyeballs bulged from their sockets, and he was left temporarily blinded. It was December the 10th, 1954. What may have seemed like an act of mindless masochism was just one of many extreme experiments for which Stapp volunteered in the name of science, his goal to learn how humans could best survive the trauma of crashing aircraft. Born in Bahia, northern Brazil in 1910, the son of Baptist missionaries, Stapp moved back with his family to the States at the age of 13 and later started college in Texas with the idea of becoming a writer. During a Christmas break in 1928, he witnessed a tragedy that changed the course of his life. While he was visiting relatives, his baby cousin crawled into a fireplace and was badly burned. For 3 days before he died, Stapp helped nurse the child and afterwards determined to become a doctor. 15 years later, having earned degrees in zoology and biophysics, he entered the University of Minnesota Medical School to pursue his dream. Upon graduation, he interned at St. Mary's Hospital, Duluth, before enlisting in the Army Medical Corps towards the end of World War II. In 1946, Stapp was transferred to the Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright Field, now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, as a project officer and medical consultant in the biophysics branch. His first assignment included a series of flights in an unpressurized aircraft at heights of 40,000 feet or more. This was a time when newly developed military jets were flying faster and higher than ever before, increasing the risk of decompression sickness, DCS, or the bends, an excruciatingly painful and potentially fatal condition first noted in aviation in the 1930s during flights of high-altitude balloons and high-flying propeller-driven aircraft. Under normal conditions, some gases from the atmosphere, mainly nitrogen, are dissolved in a person's blood. If that person then goes quickly to a much higher altitude or place of lower pressure, the gases can come out of solution in the blood and form bubbles. As the bubbles try to escape, they give rise to a variety of symptoms, the most common of which is mild to extreme pain in the joints, especially the shoulders, elbows, knees, and ankles. In the worst cases, the individual twists and doubles up in agony, hence the bends, an instinctive reaction that only makes the condition worse. Before the days of high-flying balloons and aircraft, only divers and miners tended to suffer from DCS on rare occasions if they came up too quickly from depths below the surface of the ocean or earth. The condition could be avoided by making a gradual ascent, in the case of divers about 10 meters or 33 feet per minute, but such a leisurely rate of ascent and descent isn't acceptable in flight, and the only practical alternatives are to adjust the pressurization of gas in the aircraft cabin, or to wear individual pressure suits supplied by oxygen at a pressure which automatically adjusts according to the altitude. It was to study how people react to loss of pressure at high altitude and how best to address the problem that experiments had to be done on human guinea pigs in the immediate post-war years. To carry out these tests, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engined prop-driven heavy bomber much used against German targets, was drastically modified to be able to fly into the stratosphere. Stripped of all weaponry and with redesigned engines, it could cruise for hours at altitudes of nearly 45,000 feet. In the spring of 1946, this war machine-turned-research vehicle took to the air, its interior unpressurized and unheated, with a flight crew condemned to shiver in sub-zero temperatures, while at the back alone sat Captain Stapp, following one of the unwritten rules of human volunteer testing. Whatever you'd like to subject others to, you have to be willing to visit on yourself. The questions Stapp was trying to answer were critical to the future of aviation. How would the body react to prolonged exposure at high altitude? Could humans properly function physically and mentally in this regime? How could they keep themselves from freezing, dehydrating, or becoming incapacitated by the bends? After a total of 65 hours flying half as high again as Mount Everest, Stapp had accumulated a mass of invaluable data. Thanks largely to his efforts, physiological issues were resolved that smoothed the way for the next generation of high-altitude aircraft. They also helped refine techniques for what became known as HALO, high-altitude low-opening jumps, which eventually involved individuals leaping from balloon-borne capsules at the edge of space. Avoiding the bends at high altitude proved a particularly tough nut to crack. In the end, Stapp's experiment showed that breathing pure oxygen for half an hour prior to takeoff would eliminate the symptoms entirely. This was a crucial breakthrough in the development of systems to avoid depressurization effects. As a dubious reward for his pioneering work on high-altitude flight, Stapp was assigned to head up the Aero Med Lab's top priority project codenamed MX-981, the study of severe deceleration on the human body. It had become a rule of thumb in the military that the most extreme jolt a person could survive during a collision was 18 G, where 1 G is the force of gravity acting on a body at sea level. As a result, airplane cockpits weren't built to withstand anything greater than this G-force. Yet during the war, evidence emerged that cast serious doubt on the 18 G threshold. There were cases where Navy pilots had slammed into the islands of aircraft carriers or into other aircraft so hard and fast that according to accepted wisdom they should have died instantly. Instead, they walked away with barely a scratch. More troubling were the many less violent crashes in which it seemed clear that the pilot had survived the initial impact, only to be killed by failure of the seat harness or cockpit structure. These incidents underscored the need for rigorous scientific studies of how air safety could be improved. What were the true levels of G-force that the human body could tolerate, and for how long? What was the maximum speed at which a pilot could safely eject? How could seats, harnesses, and other equipment be developed to better protect their users? In April 1947, Stapp travelled to Los Angeles to check out the human decelerator being built at Muroc Army Airfield. A key element of this was a 2,000-foot-long track laid down during the war for testing German V-1 missiles, the infamous buzz bombs. At one end of the track, engineers from Northrop Corporation had fitted sets of hydraulic brakes capable of slowing a rocket sled from 150 miles per hour to half that speed in 1/5 of a second, a deceleration equivalent to that experienced in a plane crash. The sled itself, nicknamed G-Whiz, was built of welded tubes, measured 14 feet long and just over 6 feet wide, weighed about 1,350 pounds, and sat on a series of magnesium slippers. Atop the chassis was a tough, specially built seat, and to the rear a telemetry antenna mast and a rack that could hold up to 4 rocket bottles. These bottles, the same type used to boost aircraft off short runways, could each produce about 5,000 pounds of thrust. By varying the number of bottles and the brake pressure, the occupant could be subjected to a wide variety of unpleasant G-forces. The occupant was intended to have been a 185-pound dummy known as Oscar 8-Ball. The staff at the Aero Med Lab hadn't even contemplated running human tests because of the obvious risks. However, all that changed with the arrival of Stapp. Having introduced himself to George Nichols, Northrop's top engineer on the site, Stapp walked over to Oscar 8-Ball, patted it on the head and said, "You can throw this away. I'm going to be the test subject." But Stapp was no reckless fool. Oscar would still make the first trips on the Whiz, and a good thing too. During the initial run on April 30th, 1947, the hydraulic brakes and backup restraint system failed, and the Whiz slid off the track into the desert. In a later test, in which the intrepid dummy was blasted down the track at 150 miles per hour wearing only a light safety belt, the brakes locked, producing a savage deceleration. The belt snapped, and Oscar sailed through an inch-thick wooden windscreen, leaving his rubber face behind, before finally coming to rest in a mangled heap 700 feet downrange. After 8 months and 35 test runs using the hapless mannequin, Stapp was ready to try out the Whiz himself. For his first outing, he used only one rocket and sat facing backwards to minimize the effects of the G-load. Suffering only a few sore muscles from the experience, the next day he added 2 more rockets, and so the experimentation went on. With each new run, Stapp tinkered with the thrust and braking, not only to step up the G-forces but also the time it took for the forces to build to maximum and their duration. By August 1948, Stapp had made 16 runs and endured up to 35 G, far beyond the supposedly lethal 18 G, without any survival limit in sight. Not that Stapp escaped the process without discomfort or injury. Every time he rode the Whiz, his seat harness bit painfully into his shoulders, and at higher Gs his ribs occasionally cracked under the pressure. He also suffered concussions, lost fillings from his teeth, fractured his collarbone, and broke his wrist twice when his arm flapped free in the vicious airstream. On one occasion he set the fracture himself on the way back to his office. But of all the medical issues Stapp encountered, the most worrying centered on his eyes. During backwards-facing tests, the big problem was whiteouts caused by blood suddenly draining from his eyeballs and pooling at the back of his head. In later runs, when he faced forwards, the blood rushed the other way and pushed against his retinas, rupturing capillaries, filling the front of his eyes with blood and causing redouts. After many months, Stapp's superiors at the Aero Med Labs got wise to what he was up to and were appalled. Along with a promotion to major designed to keep him busy with paperwork, Stapp was given a reminder of the officially recognized 18G survivability limit and an admonition to stop deceleration tests on people, notably himself. From now on, the brass insisted if there were any live experimentation, it would be done on chimpanzees. But that decision was soon reversed. As the import of Stapp's findings sank in, it became obvious that human tests had been key to exposing the inadequacy of certain types of aircraft restraint systems. New designs were brought in almost right away. The advantage of rear-facing seats in a collision was also driven home by the new data, and from that point on, all new transport aircraft were fitted with this kind of seating. Most significantly, Stapp had put the lie to the 18G limit. The fact that the human body could withstand forces of 30G or more for brief periods meant that seats, harnesses and cockpits had to be beefed up to remain secure beyond that limit. The next series of rocket sled tests using a new heavyweight harness that allowed forward-facing runs was aimed at refining the data. Beginning in June 1949, the Whiz was pushed to further extremes, sometimes with Stapp aboard, sometimes with other human volunteers, and sometimes with chimps. And it was around this time that Murphy's Law was born. There really was a Murphy, an Air Force engineer called Captain Ed Murphy, who came out to Muroc with some new strain gauges to give a more precise measure of the decelerations being produced by the Whiz. One of Murphy's assistants fitted the gauges to Stapp's harness but managed inadvertently to wire 2 of them the wrong way, so that all the readings cancelled out. On this particular run, Stapp had a rough ride and ended up staggering away from the sled with bloodshot eyes and bleeding sores. Wired the way they were, the sensors read 0, literally nullifying Stapp's efforts, and Murphy was not pleased. "If there's any way they can do it wrong," he remarked, "they will." This comment made the rounds at the track and ended up gaining worldwide fame when paraphrased by Stapp during a press conference. In June 1951, Stapp made his last run on the whiz, soaking up more than 35 G, about as much punishment as the sled could mete out with all 4 rockets blazing and the brakes at their peak setting. In total, it had been used for 74 manned runs and 80 others with chimps. The tests established a standard strength requirement for aircraft seats of 32 G, which was rapidly put into practice. Yet while the whiz had helped answer many questions about crash deceleration, a new conundrum had emerged. In 1951, no one had yet ejected from an aircraft at supersonic speed and lived to tell the tale. Very little was known about the effects of wind blast and deceleration acting on a pilot bailing out in that regime. But sooner or later pilots would be forced into attempting supersonic escapes. Would they survive? And what could be done to improve their chances? The G-Whiz had reached its limits, so in 1953 Stapp relocated to the Aeromedical Field Laboratory at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, where a much longer sled track was in place, terminating in a segment that could be dammed and filled with water. By equipping a sled with water scoops and varying the water depth precisely, various braking speeds and durations could be produced. Northrop built a new sled called the Sonic Wind No. 1, which was slightly longer and wider than the Whiz and could carry up to 12 rockets, with a combined thrust of 50,000 pounds. It also had a 2-stage design. After the rocket bottles burned out, the propulsion sled was jettisoned, allowing the subject sled to continue on without the extra load. In theory, the wind could travel up to 750 miles per hour and deliver a bone-crushing 150 G. In November 1953, the Wind was put through its paces with Sierra Sam, an upgraded test dummy. A few months later, Stapp made his first trip down the new track. "I assure you," he quipped to a reporter as he boarded, "I'm not looking forward to this." Burning 6 rockets, the Wind topped out at 421 miles per hour after just 5 seconds and was still doing 313 miles per hour when it hit the water brake. In the space of 190 feet, the sled slowed to 153 miles per hour, producing up to 22 G. For a few moments, Stapp felt as if he weighed 3,500 pounds, and for over half a second he endured 15 G. That was nearly twice as long as any similar effect ever produced at Muroc. "I feel fine," Stapp said after the run. "This sled is going to be a wonderful test instrument." So it proved. On December the 10th, 1954, after many more grueling but fruitful sessions on the Wind, Stapp took the sled chair for his 29th, final, and most extreme ride. He would push into the transonic zone near the speed of sound, reaching Mach 0.9. He'd be facing into the onrushing airstream, protected only by a helmet, visor, and regulation flight suit. His major concern was that he would lose his sight. Prior to this last trip, he'd practiced dressing and undressing with the lights out, so if I was blinded, I wouldn't be helpless. With 10 minutes to go before the big run, George Nichols helped fit a rubber bite block equipped with an accelerometer into Stapp's mouth. As the seconds ticked away, a Lockheed T-33 Shooting Star chase plane approached, its throttle pushed wide open in anticipation of the launch. With 5 seconds to go, Stapp activated the sled's movie cameras and hunkered down for the mind-numbing jolt. The Sonic Wind's 9 rockets roared into life, spewing 30-foot-long flames and hurling Stapp down the track and past the chase plane as if it was standing still. A few seconds into the run, the sled had peaked out at 632 miles per hour, subjecting Stapp to 20 G and battering him with wind pressures of nearly 2 tons. Then, just as the sound of the rocket's initial blast reached the ears of far-off observers, the Wind hit the water brake, throwing out spray 30 yards on either side before grinding to a halt, as if it had hit a sandbank. Stapp had maxed out at 40 G deceleration and temporarily blacked out. The ground crew raced to the scene, followed by an ambulance. An agitated Nichols leapt onto the sled, anxious to assure himself that Stapp was still alive. His eyes were a mess, filled with blood. When sonic wind had hit the water break, it was the equivalent of a Mach 1.6 ejection at 40,000 feet, only it had lasted perhaps 9 times longer. As attendants helped the injured man onto a waiting stretcher, even Stapp worried that he'd pushed his luck too far. "This time," he remarked, "I get the white cane and the seeing eye dog." But when surgeons at the hospital examined him, they found that his retinas hadn't detached as feared. Within minutes, Stapp could see blue specks, and a short time later he could discern one of the surgeon's fingers. By the next day, his vision had returned more or less to normal. But Stapp's life would never be the same again. Dubbed the fastest man on Earth by the media, he became a scientific celebrity. He appeared on the pages of Collier's and Life magazines, was the subject of a Hollywood B-movie, and featured in an episode of This Is Your Life. Meanwhile, he announced plans to crack the sound barrier on land and beyond that attempt a 1,000-mile-per-hour run. But those were steps too far for his superiors, and their caution turned out to be justified. In June 1956, while engaged in an 80 G test, sonic wind left its track and was badly damaged. Human experimentation was put on hold. And although Stapp would take part in subsequent tests on an air-powered sled known as the Daisy Track, his days as a rocket man were over.